If you struggle with opening jars, like so many of us do, you are going to love this easy sewing project. It is for a DIY jar opener, and the grippy part of this jar opener makes opening up those tight tops a breeze. So let's get to it. You're going to need some fabric and some shelf liner. I got the shelf liner at the Dollar Tree. It comes in a variety of colors, so you can mix and match with the type of fabric that you want to use. You could also use a rug grip product as well. So cut squares of 7 inches by 7 inches. You can do it 6 by 6, 6.5 by 6.5, just somewhere around the 6 to 7 inch mark, and make it an equal square. Then, whatever size you decide to do the fabric, cut one piece of the shelf liner in that same size. So now is a great time to iron out the wrinkles in the fabric. You might not necessarily want to be doing it once the plastic is in there. So put one piece of fabric with the pretty side up, then a piece of shelf liner, then fabric with the pretty side down, so it is sandwiched like you see it right here. Then you are going to be clipping all around the corners, and it is so much easier to use sewing clips rather than pins, but if you need to use pins, that's okay too. All right, now we are going to start sewing. You want to keep a gap about 3 to 4 inches big open, but you want to sew the rest of all the sides together. So I went ahead and inserted the needle. Be sure to backstitch at the beginning of your stitching as well as at the end. When you get to the corners, just make sure that your needle is in the fabric. Pick up the presser foot, spin the fabric around, put the presser foot back down, and then start sewing again. And just remove your clips as needed as you go by. I used about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on this, the width of the presser foot. You can use a 1/2 inch seam allowance if you'd like. Either one is going to work fine. And again, I'm showing you how to keep the needle inserted in the fabric and pivot that fabric and then start sewing again. And you want to be sure that the needle is inserted, because otherwise your stitching is just going to get all wonky. You're not going to be able to line it up right. The fabric starts slipping. It's just not going to look great. So as we continue sewing around these edges, for those of you that might be watching my videos in the past, well, actually, let me stop and say, see, sometimes you don't get it quite to the end. So in this case, I just did the presser or the needle forward by turning the handle on the side, just once and twice to get it to that position, and then started sewing like normal again with the presser foot with the foot. So if you need to get to a specific position and you're not quite there and you feel like using the foot pedal is going to be a little bit too fast and you're going to kind of over compensate, then just do the handle and turn it once or twice and get it to that position. But anyways, I am coming up to the opening right there. I am back stitching and then completing that. So now I'm going to be cutting the corners. You want to cut it close, but be sure not to cut over that stitching. And you are doing this so that you reduce the bulk that has to be turned inside out and has to be in that corner. Now, I also trimmed up a little bit of the seam allowances on either side. This doesn't have to be done. If you do it, and I found out, I realized after I did it, at that opening that isn't sewn closed yet, be sure to leave a decent amount of fabric hanging over so that you can turn it inside out and top stitch it. I failed to do that, and it's just really hard to turn those seams under when there's hardly any seam there. So now I am turning it inside out. You're going to have fabric on one side and the shelf liner on the other. Takes a little bit of finagling to get that out because obviously the shelf liner is a little grippy. So just do it a little bit at a time and then you will get it turned out. Be sure to push out those corners too. You want to get those nice and square. There's going to be a lot of bulk in there, so just be sure to push them out with your finger or with a turning tool. Either way is going to work just fine. I like my flamingo turning tool any chance that I have to use it. It has a little bit more of a blunt end, actually has a little bit more of a pointed end than I would hope for, but it's just so cute. I will still continue to use it. So as I was saying before, this flame fabric, if you have watched one of my thrift store fabric hauls, you'll notice that this fabric was in that haul. Was wondering what to do with it, and I think this is the perfect idea to be using it for jar openers. Definitely suits the kitchen theme and vibe. And now as I continue to turn out those corners, we are ready to turn under those unfinished seams. As I said, I cut a little bit too close, not thinking on this one. So if I had left this area a little bit larger, it would have been easier to tuck those inside, tuck them under and then inside, and then I'm going to clip them down. And we are going to be securing this part of the seam when we go through and top stitch around the jar opener. Now I'll just go ahead and say right now that there are going to be a few variations of how to do this. I'm going to talk about some variations for this sewing project at the end, so be sure to listen to those because there are quite a few ways of making these DIY jar openers. So now we're going to be top stitching all the way around the entire square, being sure to get those unfinished seams in there. And I'm going to be doing it really close to the edge. I'd say maybe this is about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Honestly, you don't have to measure it necessarily, especially if your thread is really matching the fabric really well. It's not going to be too visible. So just go ahead and be sure to backstitch at the beginning of your stitching and at the end, and go around that square just as you did before. Now, one of those variations that I'm going to be talking about is a lot of people are concerned that the shelf liner is too grippy and you're not going to be able to sew and the fabric's not going to move. This is Dollar Tree. You can see me kind of like trying to figure out how many stitches I'm going to be going forward and figuring that out. So that's what I'm doing right there. But this is Dollar Tree shelf liner. I did not find it to be a problem to push the fabric through the needle and to have it slide easily. In the corners was more of the issue because there was a lot of bulk and it was kind of catching a little bit. So if it is catching just a little bit, you can slightly tug on it, gently tug on it to bring the fabric through underneath the presser foot and to sew it. And one of the hacks that I have to reduce the grip, if you are using a super grippy like rug grip or you really are having a problem, and I'll show this later, but is to put some tissue paper or parchment paper there underneath the jar opener and it will glide more easily. I don't suggest sewing tissue paper to the back of this. It just seems like a step that maybe isn't necessary, especially if you're making multiple ones of these. You can see right there that the corner got stuck and I had to kind of push it through. But as I was saying, if you're making multiples of these for Christmas gifts, for craft fairs, for friends and family, you don't want to be adding on any more steps than necessary. That's why if you need to do something to prevent the grippiness, I would suggest putting a parchment paper or tissue paper on the left-hand side of your sewing machine. I'll show you how to do that at the end. So I mentioned you might be making multiples of these. In the written blog posts that I have, and I will put a link in the description below, I break down the cost of what these are. And roughly the cost is going to be, I think it was between 37 cents and 57 cents each. So you can make a decent profit on these if you are selling them. And that's why you might want to be making quite a few at a time. So now you can see the stitching through the shelf liner on the back. And we are done. It is literally that easy. So I am going to be talking about some variations now. Again, there are multiple ways of doing this. You can use just one layer of fabric if you want. You don't have to use two, Really, the reason for 2 layers of fabric is because you might see the wrong side of that fabric through the shelf liner. It might not be pretty. In this case, the fabric that I used was actually quite pretty. Couldn't really tell too much of a difference. So you can use just one. You can stitch an X across that jar opener. Just do that by stitching a straight line diagonally across the square. Do that both ways. That will keep the fabric from bunching up as you're twisting it and using it with your hand to open up the jar. Not necessary, but it is a decorative feature, and it might be something that keeps the fabric in line a little bit easier. And then this is that parchment paper hack. Just go ahead and put a piece of parchment paper very close up to the needle, but not under the needle, and tape that down with some painter's tape. If you want to save this idea for later, be sure to visit the blog post link in the description below to pin this to Pinterest or to email it to yourself. Happy sewing!